Small Differences, a Manifesto. All of history has been characterized by conflicts between people, which are in turn driven by our nature to notice ultimately insignificant personal differences. This tendency is termed by Sigmund Freud as the narcissism of small differences. He describes it as the phenomenon that it is precisely communities with adjoining territories, and related to each other in other ways as well, who are engaged in constant feuds and in ridiculing each other, like the Spaniards and Portuguese, for instance, the North and South Germans, the English and Scotch, and so on. Freud considers this simply a convenient and relatively harmless satisfaction of the inclination to aggression, perhaps because he believed that the phenomenon doesn't lead to real harm of people. In fact, this phenomenon is the key to understanding some of the most violent conflicts in history. There's the extermination of the Jews during the Holocaust, and, as a matter of fact, all the instances of violence towards Jewish people. There's the American Civil War, one of the United States' bloodiest battles between its own people. There's the slavery of black people in the United States, which resulted in a perpetual violent discrimination toward them for the rest of American history. I can list many, many more, but it is nearly impossible to make an exhaustive list, as every region of the world has experienced violence that is derived from man's inclination to notice even those minor differences between himself and others, between his own tribe and another. This ability to discern ourselves and others may have at one time been a key to survival. In the context of the tribalism of, for lack of a better phrase, primitive people, the ability to recognize who is and isn't in our group is logical and natural, and therefore can't be criticized in itself. As Freud writes, the advantage which a comparatively small cultural group offers of allowing this instinct an outlet in the form of hostility against intruders is not to be despised. However, in a context of a highly diversified civilization, this tribalistic tendency is incredibly dangerous. It is a reflex and ingrained habit that we must fight to inhibit. When closely examined, we can observe the fallacy of the narcissism of small differences. Biologically, there are no differences between different racial groups. There is no fundamental difference that really separates anyone into groups. For Americans, this is an especially dangerous habit that is especially hard to break, because it has been exercised so often and taught so early. What is it that breaks this habit? 1. Consciousness. There is no way to stop a habit without being aware of it. For the listener, this awareness will be rendered by listening to this work. However, for those not aware of this manifesto, how will they be conscious of their tendency to recognize minor differences? It is necessary that the listener, and subsequently the listener's peers, spread this message. 2. Willpower. There must be a motivation to break a habit. This, of course, is the knowledge that all human conflicts derive from the tendency of differentiation. The ability to restrain oneself from judgment, willpower, can only come from repeated practice. It all begins with, when confronted with any person or group, especially in the context of political news, a decision to withhold judgment about that person or group's inherent characteristics. 3. Empathy. Empathy is the ability to understand other people. When the urge to judge and differentiate approaches, ask yourself, what are the circumstances that led this person or group to think or act this way? You'll find that, while imagining yourself in these circumstances, you may think or act the same way. There is, however, an exception for some human behaviors. The acts of particularly cruel criminals is thoroughly incomprehensible. 4. Accountability. A social change requires a widespread and enthusiastic compliance with doctrine, as well as the enforcement of the doctrine. It is important that we encourage each other to stop focusing on differences and reprimand those that perpetuate the ill habit. On an individual level, the tendency to differentiate oneself from others is typical, especially in a rather individualist country like the United States. It can be narcissistically pleasurable to decide that what makes you different from another is also what makes you better than them, and the strive toward individuality is what largely motivates creative and personal endeavors that have resulted in much of humankind's achievements. However, we must be careful in understanding that, although the differences between individuals results in the beautiful diversity of ideas, these differences are not a reason to feel superiority. And although ideas may differ in practical and theoretical value, This value shouldn't be assigned to a person's personality, circumstance, or origin, especially because the same idea can arise from very different people. The source of all social issues is man's inherent tendency and desire to differentiate himself from others. This narcissism of small differences is the greatest social issue of all, and urgently requires our efforts to extinguish it before it leads to greater harm of people.